The air is so cold it feels sharp, like a blade pressing against the inside of your lungs. You can smell the heavy metallic scent of damp earth and the charcoal tang of a fire that died out hours ago. Your skin is pebbled with goosebumps, and your stomach is a hollow, aching knot of hunger that hasn't been properly quieted in days. This was the baseline of human existence for 99% of our history. Now think about your own life. Why are you here? Out of the billions of people who have ever walked this earth, how did your specific bloodline manage to navigate a world where a simple infected scratch or a week of bad weather meant the end of everything? More importantly, how did your ancestors survive the single most dangerous period of human life? Childhood? We know that in the Pleistocene, nearly half of all children didn't make it to their 15th birthday. So, what happened to the ones who lost the only people biologically programmed to keep them alive? How did a prehistoric orphan survive in a world without orphanages, without social workers, and without a single spare calorie to give away? It seems logical to assume that ancient life was a tally of cold, hard math, where a child without parents was simply a burden the group couldn't afford to carry. But that logic is fundamentally flawed. If ancient humans were truly that ruthless, you wouldn't be here to wonder about it. But if the group was actually saving these children, how did they do it without modern resources? Was it a matter of pure altruism, or was there a hidden, more practical reason for their kindness? And what does the answer tell us about the way our own brains are wired today? To find the answer, we have to look at the people who still live in the shadows of our ancestors. For decades, researchers have been obsessed with alloparenting, the scientific term for anyone who isn't a biological parent providing care for a child. You might think this is a modern convenience, something we invented with daycare and babysitters, but the data suggests it is actually the very thing that made us human. In 1992, researcher Edward Tronick and a team of developmental psychologists embedded themselves with the Efi pygmies in the Ituri forest of the Congo. The Efi are one of the most isolated hunter-gatherer groups left on the planet, living in a way that provides a window into our collective past. What Tronick found wasn't just surprising, it was a total dismantling of the Western nuclear family ideal. Ife infants, from the very hour they are born, are passed from hand to hand. By the time they are just 3 weeks old, an Ife baby is being cared for by an average of 14 different people. 14. By the age of 4 months, these infants are spending more than half of their waking hours in the arms of someone who is not their mother. This wasn't because the mothers were neglectful. It was because the entire social structure was built on the assumption that one pair of hands is never enough. But does this communal care actually lead to better survival, or does it just spread the risk? If a child is everyone's responsibility, does that mean they eventually become no one's responsibility? And how does this sharing of children change the stakes when a tragedy actually strikes? You'd think that having so many caregivers would create a chaotic, unstable environment for a developing brain. However, the exact opposite is true. This system created a biological buffer. If a mother was injured or couldn't produce enough milk, the child didn't starve. They were simply shifted to the next person in line. But this raises a darker question. Why would an unrelated adult give up their own resources for a child that doesn't carry their genes? In the brutal economy of the ancient world, every ounce of honey and every scrap of meat was precious. Why share it with an orphan? This brings us to the work of Alyssa Crittenden and Frank Marlowe, who spent years studying the Hadza people of Tanzania. The Hadza are often cited as the gold standard for understanding ancient human behavior because they have lived in the same region, foraging the same foods for thousands of years. Crittenden and Marlowe discovered that among the Hadza, a child's survival isn't just tied to their mother, it's tied to the grandmother hypothesis. This theory, famously championed by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, suggests that humans evolved long lifespans specifically so that older women, who could no longer reproduce, could focus all their energy on keeping their grandchildren alive. Among the Hadza, grandmothers are the most productive foragers in the entire group. They work harder and find more calories than even the strongest young men in some seasons. When a child's mother dies, the grandmother doesn't just step in, she is often already providing the majority of the child's calories. But what if the grandmother is gone too? What happens when the biological safety net is completely shredded? Does the group's collective instinct have a limit, or is there a point where an orphan becomes a liability that has to be discarded? That sounds like a moment where the survival of the fittest would take over and leave the weak behind. But the archaeological record tells a much more complex story. Consider the case of Romito II, a skeleton found in a cave in Italy dating back roughly 10,000 years. It belonged to a young man with a form of severe dwarfism that would have made it impossible for him to hunt or participate in the grueling daily labor of a hunter-gatherer group. Yet, the bones show he lived well into his teens. He was fed, protected, and carried by his group for years, despite the fact that he could never pay them back in the traditional sense. If ancient groups were willing to keep a disabled teenager alive for over a decade, the fate of a healthy orphan starts to look very different. The Ashe people of Paraguay provide another layer of evidence. Researchers Kim Hill and A. Magdalena Hurtado studied the Ashe for years and found that while the loss of a parent was a significant risk factor, orphaned children were often adopted by the group's best hunters. These men, often unrelated to the child, would take on the role of a secondary father. Why? Because in a small group of 25 people, every single human life is an investment. But is investment the right word, or is that just us projecting modern capitalism onto the past? Does a hunter-gatherer look at a 3-year-old and see a future asset? Or is there something deeper, something written into our neurobiology that makes it impossible for us to ignore a crying child? And if we were built for this kind of communal care, what happens to us when we try to live without it? The answer might lie in our hormones. Humans are one of the few species on Earth categorized as cooperative breeders. This means we are biologically primed to respond to infants that aren't ours. When any human, male or female, parent or not, holds an infant or even just hears one cry, our brains release oxytocin, the bonding hormone. This isn't a cultural choice, it's a physiological reflex. Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, an evolutionary anthropologist at UC Davis, argues in her book Mothers and Others that this specific trait is exactly why humans were able to outcompete other hominids like the Neanderthals. While chimpanzees and gorillas are incredibly protective of their young, they are also incredibly suspicious. A chimp mother will rarely let another female even touch her infant for months. This means if that mother dies, the infant's chances of survival drop to near zero. Humans, however, evolved to be pro-social. We learned to trust others with our most precious cargo. This trust allowed our ancestors to settle in more diverse environments, to have children more frequently, and to ensure that when a parent died, as they frequently did, the child didn't become a ghost. But if this was our great strength, why does the modern world feel so different? Why do we now live in isolated boxes, struggling to raise children in a nuclear setting that our ancestors would have found terrifyingly lonely? You might argue that we don't need the village anymore because we have the state. We have foster care, we have schools, and we have hospitals. But a 2023 review from the University of Cambridge suggests we might be kidding ourselves. The researchers looked at child rearing across various societies and found that the more modern and individualistic a culture becomes, the more the mental health of both the parents and the children suffers. In hunter-gatherer societies, the alloparenting system provides a structural buffer. When a crisis hits, the network absorbs the blow automatically. In our world, a crisis often leads to a total collapse because there is no network, only a series of bureaucratic safety nets that are often too slow or too rigid to help. So, what does this tell us about the orphans of 50,000 years ago? It tells us they weren't orphans in the way we understand the word. They didn't have a change in legal status. They didn't go to a different cave. They stayed in the same place, surrounded by the same faces, eating the same food. The loss was personal and emotional, but it wasn't existential. The child was already owned by the group. They were already being raised by the others. But if this system was so perfect, why did it ever change? Why did we trade the security of the tribe for the autonomy of the individual? And can we ever truly go back to the way we were built to live? This shift didn't happen because we found a better way to raise kids. It happened because we changed the way we got our food. When humans transitioned to agriculture roughly 10,000 years ago, we started staying in one place. We started accumulating stuff: land, grain, animals. Suddenly, it mattered very much who your real father was, because he was the one who owned the land you would inherit. The communal sharing of children started to look like a threat to the tidy lines of inheritance. We traded the safety of the many for the property of the few. But your body doesn't know that. Your DNA still thinks you're living in a group of 30 people in the savannah. That's why when a neighbor watches your kid for an hour or a teacher goes out of their way to help a struggling student, it feels so right. It's an echo of a 50,000-year-old survival strategy. It's the reason that even in the most brutal, leaning on the edge of extinction times, our ancestors didn't leave the children behind. They couldn't. To leave a child behind was to leave a piece of the future behind, and those ancient groups understood that better than we ever will. But wait, does this mean that ancient life was some kind of communal utopia where everyone was happy and cared for? Hardly. We have to be careful not to romanticize the past. The data from the Ashe and the Hadza also shows that while groups were incredibly supportive, life was still violent and short. Infanticide existed. Desertion happened in times of extreme famine, but the default setting, the baseline of the human experience, was one of radical inclusion. The orphaned child wasn't a problem to be solved, they were a life to be lived. Consider the wow fact that anchors this entire reality. In some hunter-gatherer groups, children are so well integrated into the group's economy that by age 8, they are providing up to 40% of their own food through foraging and small game hunting. An orphan wasn't just a mouth to feed, they were a pair of hands that could help the group survive. They were a future defender, a future storyteller, a future grandmother who would one day keep the next generation alive. The group didn't keep them alive out of charity. They kept them alive because they were the group. Now ask yourself, if you were stripped of your modern life, your house, your bank account, your grocery store, who are the 25 people who would keep your child alive? Who is your village? For most of us, that's a terrifying question because we've spent the last few centuries tearing those villages down. We've traded the many hands of the Ife for the single parent or the nuclear couple. And then we wonder why we're so exhausted. We wonder why our children are so anxious. We are trying to run a communal piece of hardware on an individualistic operating system, and the software is crashing. But there is a silver lining in this data. Because this instinct for allo-parenting is biological, it isn't gone. It's just dormant. We see it flare up during natural disasters, when neighbors who have never spoken suddenly start sharing food and watching each other's kids. We see it in found families and tight-knit communities. We are still the same species that passed infants hand to hand in the Congo Basin. We are still the species that kept Romito II alive despite his disabilities. We are still the species that views an orphaned child not as a stranger, but as a son or daughter of the tribe. Think back to that physical sensation we started with. The biting cold, the smell of smoke, the hollow ache of hunger. In that world, the most terrifying thing wasn't a predator in the dark. It was the prospect of being alone. Our ancestors survived because they realized that the only way to beat the cold was to huddle together. The only way to beat hunger was to share the kill. And the only way to beat death was to make sure that even if a parent fell, the child remained standing. Does this mean we need to abandon our cities and move back into the woods? No. But it does mean we need to stop pretending that the nuclear family is the natural state of humanity. It's an experiment, a very recent one, and the results are mixed at best. The natural state of humanity is a messy, loud, crowded, and deeply connected group where children are the responsibility of everyone. The orphan of the ancient world survived because there was no such thing as someone else's child. There were only the children of the people, and the people did not let their future die. In the end, the story of the ancient orphan is actually your story. Somewhere in your family tree, Back in the long, dark stretch of the Pleistocene or the early Holocene, there was a child whose parents didn't make it. Maybe they were lost to a lion or a fever or a flash flood. That child should have died. By all the laws of nature and survival of the fittest, that child was finished. But they weren't. Someone reached out. Someone who didn't have to. Someone who was tired and hungry and scared themselves, but who looked at that child and saw something worth saving. They picked that child up. They shared their meager portion of roots or meat. They carried them through the snow and protected them from the rain. They did this for years, expecting nothing in return but the continued survival of the group. And because they did, that child grew up. They had children of their own, and those children had children. Through tens of thousands of years of war, famine, and plague, that act of unnecessary kindness was passed down, link by link, until it reached you. You are the living proof that the brutal ancient world was actually a place of radical cooperation. You are the evidence that we are not a species of loners, but a species of partners. What are you going to do with that knowledge? How does it change the way you look at the people in your own life who are struggling? If we were built to be the village, what's stopping us from building one right where we are? The answer might be simpler than we think. It starts with acknowledging that we were never meant to do this alone. It ends with the realization that the other is not a stranger, but a potential caregiver, a potential protector, a potential part of our survival. The ancient world was a place of extreme scarcity, but it was also a place of extreme social wealth. We have traded one for the other, and perhaps it's time we started looking for a balance. Think about that metallic scent of damp earth again. Think about the charcoal tang of the fire. Our ancestors are long gone. Their bones turned to dust in caves and riverbeds. But their strategy for survival is still beating in your chest. It's in the way you feel a pang of worry when you hear a child cry in a grocery store. It's in the way you feel a surge of relief when someone offers to help you carry a heavy load. That isn't just politeness. That is the survival instinct of a cooperative breeder. That is the ghost of the village reminding you who you actually are. When we look back at those 50,000 years of human history, the most remarkable thing isn't the tools we made or the caves we painted. It's the children we didn't leave behind. It's the fact that in a world that gave us every reason to be selfish, we chose to be communal. We chose to see the orphan as an opportunity rather than a burden. We chose to believe that every life was worth the cost of the fire. So, what actually happened to the kids whose parents didn't make it? They survived. They thrived. They became the ancestors of the world we see today. They proved that the most powerful technology humans ever invented wasn't the spear or the wheel. It was the ability to care for someone who can do nothing for us in return. And that, more than anything else, is what makes us human. The data from the Hadza, the Ife, and the Ashe isn't just anthropology, it's a mirror. It shows us a version of ourselves that we've mostly forgotten, a version that is stronger, more resilient, and deeply connected. It challenges the me versus the world narrative that we've been fed for generations and replaces it with a we are the world reality that is backed by hard science. It's a reminder that we are at our best when we are sharing the weight. Remember the Romito 2 skeleton? The boy with dwarfism who lived a decade longer than he should have? When archaeologists found his grave, he wasn't just tossed aside. He was buried with care, laid to rest with ornaments and honors. Even in death, he was a member of the group. Even in a world of extreme physical demands, his value wasn't tied to what he could do, but to who he was. He was one of them. And so was every orphan, every lost child, and every struggling ancestor who eventually led to you. We often talk about the brutality of nature, and it is certainly there. But we forget to talk about the brutality of human kindness, an instinct so fierce and so deeply rooted that it can override the most basic urge for self-preservation. That is our true heritage. That is the secret of our success. And as you walk through your modern, isolated, often lonely world, just remember that you carry that village inside you. You are the product of 1,000 unnecessary acts of love. Now, I want to hear from you. We've talked a lot about the village and how it's been lost in the modern world. Have you ever experienced a moment where a village showed up for you? Maybe it was a neighbor, a teacher, or a complete stranger who stepped in when things were falling apart? What did that look like for you, and how do you think we can start to rebuild those kinds of networks today? Share your story in the comments. And if this deep dive into our collective survival made you see your own history a little differently, consider subscribing. We're going down more of these rabbit holes every week, uncovering the hidden stories of how we became the species we are today. Because when you really stop to look at the evidence, the most haunting proof of our ancestors' compassion isn't found in a book or a museum. It's much closer than that. It's the fact that you're here, breathing, thinking, and watching this right now. You are the living proof that 50,000 years ago, someone looked at a child that wasn't theirs, and instead of walking away, they stayed. They reached out through the cold and the hunger, and they held on. They held on long enough for the fire to be relit, and they held on long enough for you to be born. That isn't just history. That's a debt we all carry, and the only way to pay it back is to make sure the fire never goes out for the next person in line. Somewhere in that long, dark chain of survival, your existence was decided by a stranger's choice to care. Don't ever forget how much that choice cost and how much it's worth. Every single one of us is an orphan who was saved by the tribe, and the tribe is still here, waiting for us to remember how to belong to it.